The morning Silas Creedon turned 20 years old, his brother Ward handed him a wool coat with a torn lining and told him to get off the land. It was October 3rd, 1879, and the maple trees along the ridge above the Creedon homestead in Harlan County, Kentucky, had just begun to turn. Streaks of copper and rust bleeding through the green like a slow fire, working its way down the mountainside. Silas stood in the dooryard with the coat folded over one arm and a canvas sack holding everything else he owned. 2 books, a skinning knife, a hand plane that had been their father's, and $11 in mixed coin. Ward's wife, Llewellyn, watched from the porch with her arms crossed. She had a way of standing that made even a farmhouse look like a courthouse, and her mouth was set in the same thin line it had worn since the reading of the will 6 weeks prior. Their father, Amos Creedon, dead at 58 from a lung ailment that had hollowed him out over 2 wet winters, had left the farm, the house, the barn, the 72 acres of bottomland and timber, to Ward, his eldest. To Silas, the youngest of 3 boys, he had left the sheep. 14 ewes and 1 ram, no pasture to graze them on. You can sell them in town, Ward had said at the time, not unkindly. The middle brother, Ferris, had taken his share, a cash sum of $40, and left for Lexington before the dirt on the grave had settled. But Silas hadn't sold them. He'd spent 3 weeks trying to negotiate grazing rights on the back 40 acres that ran up against the hills, land so steep and rocky Ward had never bothered to fence it. But Llewellyn had shut that conversation down at the supper table with a single sentence. "We're not running a charity for sheep." Now Ward stood in the yard, looking like a man trying to swallow a stone. He wasn't cruel by nature, Silas knew. But he was married, and marriage had a way of drawing borders around a man's generosity. "There's work in Harlan," Ward said, "or you could try the mines over in Bell County." Silas looked past his brother toward the hills. The high ridges above the farm rose in a series of dark folds, thickly timbered, laced with limestone outcrops that showed white against the trees like old bones. He'd spent every free hour of his boyhood up in those hills. He knew every hollow, every spring, every place where the rock opened up, and the earth breathed warm air even in January. "I'll manage," Silas said. He whistled for the dog, a wiry, half-deaf shepherd named Tuck, and started up the hill trail with 14 ewes, 1 ram, and no clear idea of where he was going. Only that he was going up. The place he'd been thinking of was 2 miles above the homestead, in a narrow hollow where Briar Creek cut through a limestone bluff before dropping into a series of shallow pools. Silas had found it when he was 12, chasing a groundhog that vanished into a crack in the rock face. The crack opened into a passage, and the passage opened into a chamber roughly 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep, with a ceiling that arched 8 feet overhead at its highest point. The floor was dry, packed clay and broken stone. The air inside, even on that autumn day 7 years earlier, had been warm, not hot, but distinctly, unmistakably warmer than the air outside. He'd told his father about it. Amos Creedon, who had read more books than any man in Harlan County, and who kept a battered copy of James Dwight Dana's Manual of Geology on a shelf beside the family Bible, had explained it simply. The earth, deep down, held its own heat. Caves at sufficient depth maintained a nearly constant temperature year-round, somewhere around 55 degrees in this part of Kentucky. In winter, when the outside air dropped to 10 or 15 degrees, a cave would feel warm. In summer, it would feel cool. The earth itself was a kind of furnace, patient and inexhaustible, burning on a time scale that made human life look like the flare of a match head. Silas had never forgotten that. Now he stood at the mouth of that same passage, with his sheep milling nervously behind him and Tuck pressed against his leg, and he thought, "This is where I start." The first week was nothing but labor. He widened the cave entrance with a pickaxe borrowed from a neighbor named Dalton Prewitt, who asked no questions and wanted nothing in return except the promise that Silas wouldn't dynamite anything. The original crack became a doorway 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, framed with oak timbers that Silas cut, stripped, and notched himself. And he cleared the interior chamber of loose stone, leveled the floor with a mattock, and built a low wall of stacked limestone across the back third of the cave to pen the sheep at night. The sheep took to it faster than he'd expected. The cave's steady temperature, he estimated it at 54 degrees based on the behavior of a cup of water he left overnight, meant the animals were neither chilled nor overheated. They huddled in the back of the chamber, their wool dry, their breathing easy. Within days, the ewes had stopped startling at the stone walls and begun to treat the cave as simply another barn. Silas, meanwhile, slept near the entrance on a bed of hemlock boughs covered with a wool blanket. He cooked outside over a fire pit he'd ringed with creek stones. He ate what he could hunt: squirrel, rabbit, the occasional grouse, supplemented with cornmeal and salt pork he bought in Harlan with his dwindling $11. It was not comfortable, but it was his. By the end of October, he had built a rough pen outside the cave entrance using split-rail fencing, giving the sheep a 1/4 acre of browse along the creek. He had also begun to notice something about the cave that his 12-year-old self had missed. The air moved. Not dramatically, not a wind, but a slow, steady current that flowed outward from the deeper recesses of the cave and spilled gently through the entrance. On cold mornings, he could see it as a faint mist where the warm cave air met the frigid outside atmosphere. The cave was breathing. He began to experiment. Using flat stones and packed clay, he built a series of low walls inside the cave. Not solid walls, but baffled partitions with gaps at different heights. The idea came from something he'd read in one of his 2 books, a water-stained copy of the American Farmer's Encyclopedia that had been his father's, that moving air could be directed and slowed, and that slow-moving warm air held its heat longer than fast-moving air. He didn't fully understand the science, the principles of thermal mass and natural convection that a university-trained engineer might have explained to him. But he understood the effect. By channeling the cave's airflow through a series of turns before it reached the entrance, he could keep the interior warmer without blocking ventilation entirely. By November, the temperature inside the cave held steady at 57 degrees, even as the outside air plunged into the 20s. The sheep were fat and calm. Tuck slept in the doorway like a sentinel, and Silas, for the first time since his father's death, felt something he recognized as peace. The town of Harlan did not forget about Silas Creedon. It simply reclassified him. He became the caveman, a figure of mild amusement and occasional pity. When he came down to buy supplies, cornmeal, salt, coffee, the odd tool, the men at Taggart's general store would ask him how his rock house was holding up and whether the sheep had learned to read yet. Silas would answer politely, buy what he needed, and leave. Words were just sounds. They couldn't hurt him unless he let them. The first winter was the proving ground. December of 1879 brought heavy snow to Harlan County, and January was brutal. A stretch of 9 days where the temperature never rose above 12 degrees. Silas spent those days inside the cave with the sheep, emerging only to gather firewood for his cooking fire and to break the ice on the creek so the animals could drink. He'd built a sleeping platform against the cave wall, using planks he'd milled himself with the hand plane and a pit saw he'd fashioned from a broken crosscut blade. The platform kept him off the cold floor, and the wool blanket, supplemented now with 2 sheepskins from a ewe that had died in early December, kept him warm enough. He lost 3 sheep that winter. 1 to a coyote that came too close to the pen on a night when Tuck was ill. 2 to a sickness he couldn't identify. They stopped eating, grew thin, and died within a week of each other. He buried them in the frozen ground above the creek and sat in the cave afterward, alone, except for the remaining 12 animals and the dog, and allowed himself 10 minutes of grief before picking up his tools and getting back to work. Surviving was building. By spring of 1880, Silas had expanded the cave. Working with pick, mattock, and iron wedges, he'd opened a second chamber adjacent to the first, smaller, perhaps 12 feet by 10, but with a higher ceiling and a natural shelf of rock along one wall that served as both table and workbench. He ran a channel along the cave floor to direct groundwater seepage toward a natural drain at the back, keeping both chambers dry. He'd also built a proper door for the entrance, oak planks with iron hinges he'd forged himself at a makeshift forge he'd constructed from creek stones, and a bellows made of deerskin. The sheep, meanwhile, had begun to thrive in ways that surprised him. The ewes that survived the winter lambed in April, producing 9 healthy lambs, an unusually high number for a flock that size, grazing on rough hill pasture. Silas suspected the cave had something to do with it. The animals had spent the winter in dry, temperate conditions rather than standing in frozen mud or huddling in drafty barns. Their wool was thick, clean, and remarkably even in texture. When he sheared them in May and brought the fleeces to the wool buyer in Harlan, the man, a sharp-eyed trader named Booth, turned the wool over in his hands and looked at Silas with an expression that was no longer amused. "This is good wool," Booth said. "Better than good. Where are you grazing these animals?" "Up in the hills," Silas said. "You're doing something right." Booth paid him $18 for the lot, nearly double what the other hill farmers were getting. "Bring me more next year." The next 4 years followed a rhythm that Silas came to love. Each season had its work, and the work had its rewards. In spring, he lambed and sheared. In summer, he expanded the cave system, eventually carving out 4 interconnected chambers totaling nearly 2,000 square feet of habitable space, and improved the pasture along the creek by clearing brush and seeding clover he'd bought with wool money. In autumn, he culled the flock, selling surplus rams and older ewes at the Harlan market, and laid in supplies for winter. In winter, he read. He had acquired more books by then. Dalton Prewitt, who had taken a quiet interest in Silas's project, brought him volumes from his own collection. A geology text, a manual on animal husbandry, a worn copy of Thoreau's Walden that Silas read 3 times in one February. He also began keeping a journal, a practice his father had maintained and that Silas now understood the value of. He recorded temperatures inside and outside the cave, rainfall, snowfall, lambing dates, wool weights, and his own observations about the behavior of the air currents that flowed through his underground home. It was these observations that led to his most significant discovery. In the autumn of 1882, while excavating a narrow passage at the back of the deepest chamber, Silas broke through a thin wall of calcite into a space he hadn't known existed. The air that rushed past him was warmer than anything he'd felt in the cave before. Not hot, but noticeably, almost luxuriously warm. He estimated it at 70 degrees or higher. Holding up his lantern, he saw that the passage opened into a low, wide chamber whose floor was covered with a shallow pool of water. The water was warm to the touch. Steam rose faintly from its surface in the lantern light. He had found a geothermal spring. The science of it, as he would later learn, was straightforward. Groundwater, percolating downward through fissures in the limestone, eventually reached depths where the Earth's internal heat warmed it significantly. This heated water then rose back toward the surface along fault lines and fractures, emerging as warm springs. Such features were not unknown in Kentucky. There were warm springs scattered across the Appalachian region. But finding one inside a cave, accessible from a hand-dug passage, was uncommon enough to be remarkable. Silas spent 3 weeks studying the spring before he touched it. He measured the water temperature daily. It held steady at 68 degrees, varying by no more than a degree in either direction regardless of the weather outside. He tasted it carefully. Clean, with a faint mineral sharpness. He watched the water level and found it constant, fed by a source deeper than anything his pick could reach. Then he went to work. Using clay, stone, and a technique he improvised from descriptions of Roman bathhouses he'd read about in a history book Dalton had lent him, Silas built a channel to carry warm water from the spring through the main chambers of his cave. The channel ran along the base of the walls, a shallow trough lined with flat limestone and sealed with clay. The warm water flowed slowly through the living spaces, radiating heat into the stone, before draining back into the earth through a natural fissure he'd widened at the far end of the system. The effect was extraordinary. By November of 1882, the main living chamber of Silas's cave maintained a temperature of 63 degrees, warm enough to live comfortably without any fire at all. The sheep chamber, connected by a shorter run of the warm water channel, held at 59 degrees. The entire system operated silently, required no fuel, and produced no smoke. Silas Creedon had, without formal training, built a geothermal radiant heating system, a technology that the wider world would not adopt for another century. Word spread, as it always does in small places. Dalton Prewitt was the first outsider to see the completed system in December of 1882, and he told his wife, who told her sister in town, who told everyone. By January, Silas had visitors, not mocking ones, but curious farmers and their wives who climbed the hill trail to see the caveman's warm house. They came expecting a crude hole in the ground. They found 4 clean, well-lit chambers with smooth stone walls, a flowing source of warm water, fat sheep in a dry pen, and Silas Creedon sitting at a hand-built oak desk reading a book on mineralogy, comfortable in his shirt sleeves while a January wind howled outside. "How warm is it in here?" asked Orrin Taggart, the storekeeper, who had made the climb in his town shoes and arrived red-faced and skeptical. 63 degrees, Silas said. "Same as yesterday, same as it'll be tomorrow." Taggart removed his hat and looked around the chamber as if he'd walked into a church and found it full of furniture he didn't recognize. "Well," he said, "I'll be damned." Among the visitors that winter was a woman named Clara Moss. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a Welsh mining family that had come to Harlan County in 1870 to work the coal seams. Her father had died in a shaft collapse in 1876, and her mother had followed him 2 years later, from what the doctor called exhaustion, but Clara called heartbreak. She supported herself by teaching reading to miners' children in a one-room school she ran from a rented cabin near the creek fork, and she had a reputation in town as a woman who asked too many questions and didn't care enough about finding a husband. She came to the cave in February of 1883, not because of the warm water or the sheep, but because Dalton Prewitt had mentioned that Silas owned a copy of Dana's Manual of Geology, and she wanted to borrow it. Silas was splitting kindling outside the cave entrance when she appeared on the trail, wrapped in a gray wool coat with her dark hair pinned loosely under a felt hat. Tuck, old and deaf now, didn't bark. He just lifted his head and thumped his tail on the frozen ground. "Mr. Creedon," she said, "I'm told you have a book I need." He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them smiled exactly, but something in the space between them shifted, a warmth that had nothing to do with geothermal springs. "Which book?" he asked. "Dana's geology. I'm teaching my students about limestone, and I've run out of things I actually know." He liked that, the honesty of it, the willingness to admit the edge of her own knowledge. He went inside and brought her the book, and she stood in the doorway of the cave and looked past him at the stone walls, the flowing water channel, the lamplight reflecting off the ceiling. "May I come in?" she asked. He stepped aside. She stayed for 3 hours. They talked about limestone, its formation from ancient seabeds, its solubility in slightly acidic groundwater, the way it fractured along bedding planes in patterns that looked random but weren't. They talked about the warm spring, and Silas showed her his journal entries tracking the water temperature. She ran her fingers along the wall of the channel he'd built and said, "This is Roman engineering." "I read about it," he said. "I don't have any Roman training." Neither did the Romans at first. She came back the following week and the week after that. By April, she was coming every Saturday, sometimes with books of her own, sometimes with food, cornbread, dried apple pie, once a jar of honey from a hive she kept behind her cabin. They talked about geology, about sheep, about teaching, about the way knowledge moved through generations like water through limestone, slowly, finding its own channels, dissolving obstacles over time. In June of 1883, Silas asked Clara Moss to marry him. He did it in the cave, standing beside the warm water channel in the main chamber, because it was the only home he had to offer. She said yes without hesitation. "I didn't come here for the sheep, Silas," she said. "I know," he said, "but the sheep are part of the arrangement." They married in July at the county courthouse and returned to the cave, where Clara moved her books, her teaching materials, and her beehive. She immediately began improving the living quarters, hanging curtains she'd sewn from flour sacking across the chamber openings for privacy, building shelves for their combined library, and insisting on a proper kitchen area with a flat stone hearth near the entrance where smoke could escape. Within months, the cave had transformed from a bachelor's survival shelter into something that felt unmistakably like a home. The blizzard of January 1885 was the storm that changed everything. It came without adequate warning on the 14th of January, a system of Arctic air that collided with moisture from the Gulf and buried eastern Kentucky under 26 inches of snow in 36 hours. Temperatures dropped to 4 degrees below zero, the coldest anyone in Harlan County could remember. Livestock froze in their barns. Pipes burst. 2 elderly people in town died of exposure when their wood stoves couldn't keep pace with the cold. And people came up the hill. They came because they had heard about the cave that stayed warm without fire, and because they were desperate. Dalton Prewitt came first, with his wife and 3 children, then the Taggart family, then a widow named Mrs. Fenton with her infant daughter, then miners from the coal camp below the ridge, men with blackened hands and thin coats who had nowhere else to go. By the second night of the blizzard, there were 31 people in Silas Creedon's cave. He and Clara made room. They opened all 4 chambers, moved the sheep to the back pen, spread blankets and sheepskins on the stone floors, and kept the warm water channels flowing. Clara organized the food, what they had, supplemented by what people had brought, into a communal kitchen near the entrance. Silas managed the ventilation, adjusting his baffled partitions to keep the air fresh with so many bodies in the space. The cave, designed for 2 people and a flock of sheep, held 31 souls at a steady 58 degrees while the world outside tried to kill them. They stayed for 4 days. On the 3rd night, with the wind still screaming over the ridge, Orrin Taggart sat on the stone floor of the main chamber with his back against the warm wall and looked at Silas Creedon in the lamplight. "I owe you an apology," Taggart said. "I spent 3 years calling you the caveman behind your back." "I know," Silas said. "This cave saved my family." Silas handed him a cup of warm water from the spring. "The earth saved your family," he said. "I just opened the door. When the blizzard broke and the people walked back down the hill into a white, silent world, something had changed in Harlan County. Silas Creedon was no longer the caveman. He was the man who knew how the earth worked and who had used that knowledge to keep 31 people alive when the sky turned hostile. The years that followed were the fullest of his life. In the spring of 1885, a professor of geology from the University of Kentucky named Dr. Edwin Hale made the journey to Harlan County after reading a letter that Clara had written to the Lexington Herald, describing the cave's geothermal features. Hale spent 3 days in the cave, taking measurements, sampling the spring water, and examining Silas's journals with increasing amazement. "You've documented 5 years of continuous geothermal data," Hale told him. "Do you understand how valuable this is?" "It's useful to me," Silas said. "I needed to know what the water was doing." Hale published a paper in 1886 in the American Journal of Science describing the Creedon Cave geothermal system. He credited Silas by name and described his warm water heating channel as an ingenious application of natural principles that anticipates engineering solutions not yet in common practice. The paper brought more visitors, scientists, journalists, a photographer from a Cincinnati newspaper who spent 2 days trying to capture the steam rising from the spring pool in the lantern light. Silas bore the attention with the same quiet patience he brought to everything. He answered questions, showed visitors the cave, and explained what he'd learned. But he never left the hollow. The cave was his home, his work, his life's project. He continued to expand and refine it for the next 20 years. By 1890, the flock had grown to over 60 sheep, and Silas's wool, known locally as cave wool for its unusual softness and consistency, commanded premium prices from buyers as far away as Louisville. Clara continued teaching, eventually moving her school into a purpose-built cabin that Silas constructed near the cave entrance, with a warm water channel running beneath the floor to heat it. It was, as far as anyone knew, the first geothermally heated schoolhouse in America. Their first child, a son named Amos after Silas's father, was born in October of 1885. A daughter, Ruth, followed in 1887, and a second son, Henry, in 1890. The children grew up in the cave and the hollow around it, equally comfortable underground and in the open air. Amos took to the sheep and the land. Ruth inherited her mother's love of teaching and her father's patience with stone. Henry, the youngest, developed an early fascination with the spring and its warm water that would eventually lead him to study hydrology at the State College in Lexington. Ward Creedon, meanwhile, had faltered. Llewellyn's ambitions had driven them to mortgage the family farm in 1882 to buy a larger property in the bottomland. But 2 successive floods, in 1883 and 1884, destroyed their crops and drowned half their cattle. Ward sold the original homestead in 1886 to cover his debts and moved to Bell County to work in the mines. Silas heard the news from Dalton Prewitt and said nothing. He did not gloat. He did not visit. He sent, through Prewitt, a letter offering Ward work on the hill if he ever wanted it. Ward never replied. Ferris, the middle brother, had died of typhoid in Lexington in 1881. Silas hadn't learned about it until a year after the fact. He carved a small cross from limestone and set it on a ledge inside the cave, beside the lamp he lit each evening. It stayed there for the rest of his life. Silas Creedon lived to be 68 years old. He died on March 12, 1927, in the main chamber of the cave he had entered as a desperate 20-year-old with 14 sheep and a torn coat. Clara had died 2 years before him, peacefully, in her sleep, in the room they'd shared for over 40 years. In the months after her death, Silas had grown quieter, spending long hours sitting beside the warm water channel, listening to the sound of the water moving through stone. His children and 8 grandchildren gathered in the cave on the day he died. He had been ill for several weeks, a cough that wouldn't clear, a weariness he couldn't shake. But he had refused to leave the hollow. Purpose was a stronger medicine than rest, and his purpose was here, in the stone and the water, and the steady warmth that the earth offered freely to anyone patient enough to accept it. His last words, according to his son Amos, who recorded them in the journal his father had kept for 47 years, were, "There's always more to find." Henry Creedon went on to become a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, spending 30 years studying geothermal systems across the Appalachian region. He credited his father's cave with sparking his career. Ruth taught school in Harlan County for 4 decades, running the same geothermally heated classroom her father had built, until her retirement in 1934. Amos kept the sheep and the cave, maintaining both until his own death in 1952, at which point the property passed to his son, Silas II, who kept it until the county purchased it in 1971 as a historical site. The cave is still there. Visitors can walk the same passage Silas widened with a borrowed pickaxe in October of 1879. The warm water channel still flows, following the same course he carved through limestone with hand tools and Roman ambition. The spring still breathes its 68-degree water from a source so deep that geologists have never found the bottom. The sheep are gone now, but the pen walls remain, stacked limestone, fitted without mortar, still standing after more than a century. There is a plaque at the entrance, placed by the Harlan County Historical Society in 1973. It reads, in part, "Silas Creedon, 1859 to 1927, demonstrated that the earth itself provides for those who take the time to understand it. It is a modest tribute for a modest man. But modesty was the point. Silas Creedon never sought to conquer the mountain or tame the wilderness. He sought to listen to it, to feel the warmth that rose from deep places, to watch the way water moved through stone, to notice the breath of air that meant a cave was alive and willing to shelter anyone who entered with respect. The earth is patient. It holds its heat across millennia, warming stone that was ancient when the first human hands touched it. It asks nothing in return except attention, the willingness to kneel, to look closer, to press a palm against the rock and feel what it offers. Silas Creedon knelt. He looked. He found warmth where others saw only darkness. And when the cold came, as it always does, he had already built the door.